hälsar jag varmt välkommen till det här Lunchseminarium, den historiska fredagen den 14 oktober 2022. Access magasin som kommer ut efter helgen till prenumeranterna ser ut så här, det nya numret, och har en temadel som handlar om läget i USA, särskilt förstås med sikte på mellanårsvalen som äger rum den 8 november. Och vi har tillfrågat ett antal USA-kännare som medarbetar där. Och en av dessa är vi mycket glada att kunna konstatera är Fredrik Logevall, som jag har skrivit i inbjudan att han är en av USAs ledande historiker idag, och det står jag för i alla fall. och har skrivit mest uppmärksammat om Vietnamkriget, och nu är du mitt i arbetet med en stor biografi över John F. Kennedy. Jätteroligt att ha dig här. Fredrik är på en sabbatical, heter det tror jag, från Harvard och verksam i Uppsala den här hösten, men återvänder till Amerika igen. Och han ska inledningstala lite på det här temat om oro och hopp i en splittrad nation. Fredrik är född i Sverige men emigrerade i unga år, så han kommer att hålla sitt anförande på engelska, men det går bra sen när vi öppnar för frågor och synpunkter att ställa frågorna på svenska om man så vill. Fredrik, jätteroligt att ha dig här. Varsågod.
Tack. Ja, som sagt, helt okej att få frågor på svenska eller engelska. Och sen vill jag bara säga tack också. Det är mycket roligt att få vara här med er. Men som PJ säger så har jag bott utomlands ganska många år. Faktiskt 4+ årtionden. Och då är det lättare. Då blir det lättare på engelska. Så jag kör på engelska. It's probably a good time to take stock of American politics because, as PJ has indicated, we have a midterm election coming up. I'm already nervous about that election, and I'll talk a little bit about this. I want to do 3 things today in my brief remarks. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we can get into some good discussion. The discussion is always the best part of these things. I think you'll agree. So we'll do that quite soon. But I wanted to try to do 3 things. I think that the title that the magazine chose, which I guess in translated terms would be Worry and Hope in a Divided Nation, is pretty perfect actually. And so I want to frame my remarks here around that idea. I want to talk a little bit about why I'm worried. I want to talk about why I'm still hopeful. In fact, maybe even optimistic. Certainly hopeful. And then maybe, if I have time, talk a little bit about maybe some things we can do to try to strengthen American democracy. If I don't have time for that last part, then maybe we can return to that in the discussion. I'm going to speak from notes because what tends to happen when I extemporize, maybe you're the same. When I extemporize, then I have too many digressions, and I go in lots of different directions, and then we wouldn't have time for any discussion. So I'll use these notes to frame my remarks, and begin by saying the obvious, which is that the state of American democracy is not healthy. This is not unique to the United States. In fact, 2 weeks ago at Harvard, Stefan Löfven presented in a small lunch seminar at the Belfer Center, which is the center with which I'm associated at Harvard. So if I had been in residence at home, I would have been present for his lunch. But Stefan Löfven's topic was threats to democracy. And he was speaking then in universal terms. So this is something we could talk about with respect to perhaps even Sweden, certainly other places, but because of America's power and its influence, it's maybe especially important to pay attention to the American context. So that's what we're doing. The division in the country is real and it worries me. It's not something I think even by profession, I'm a historian of the United States. So I've been studying this country since I was an undergraduate. Not quite since we lived in Sweden, but for a long time. And I don't think even as a historian I would have anticipated that we'd be where we are. Namely, this withering of Americans' attachments to the nation. That can be exaggerated, and I'm going to come back to that, but I'm still concerned. Let me just tell you a brief story about this. So 14 years ago, I became a US citizen, 2008, not too long before the election. I was excited about that election. I wanted to contribute at long last to the voting process. So I became a citizen. I had been up to that point just Swedish, which of course is totally enough. I shouldn't say just Swedish. Very proud then and now to be Swedish. Now I have dual citizenship. I am both Swedish and American. But I will never forget the day in a small courthouse in central New York State when the judge swore us in. We had the swearing in ceremony to become American citizens. And he was so eloquent in a plain-spoken way, using everyday language, when he talked to us about becoming a citizen. He talked about the rights and responsibilities of, not just the rights, but the responsibilities of citizenship. He distinguished between patriotism and nationalism. Very important difference. But he had a way of, in just a few sentences, drawing out the importance of that distinction, and I'll never forget that. And then my wife and our 2 kids were sitting right there, and I was one of about 50 people in that small courthouse who were becoming citizens. I was the only Swede. But I looked at my fellow inductees, if that's a good word for it, and I thought, this is a remarkable nation. For all of its flaws, for all of its misdeeds in the past, and I study those. As PJ says, I've written about the Vietnam War. Talk about a misdeed. So it wasn't that I had a kind of Pollyanna-ish view of the country, but it hit me then. This is just a remarkable country, and I'm glad to become a citizen. I mention this because I sometimes think about that judge, and I wonder what he would say today. Would he offer the same kind of optimistic, vigorous defense of the nation? Has he become jaded, cynical? I wonder about this. And I wonder how people in the audience, people becoming citizens, would respond to that kind of message today. I hope it would still resonate. But the fact that I'm asking that question, I think, means that I have these concerns. In terms of the modern history of the nation, we're in uncharted waters, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing in America's modern history can compare with a sitting president's attempt to overturn the results of an election. My worry is that as politicians really from both parties, although I hold the Republicans much more responsible, but as politicians from both parties rush to instill fear in their supporters, their voters, and anger, fear and anger, that we're being driven further apart. I don't think we're talking about the collapse of democracy. This is something maybe we can discuss, and maybe I'll come back to briefly if I have time. I think people who are talking about that, and there have been some articles just in the last few days, maybe you saw them in the Washington Post, there was a big feature in which some of my colleagues were quoted about democracy being on its sort of last legs almost. New York Times has had pieces about this. I don't think we're talking about the incipient collapse of it, but we're more divided than ever, and I worry that we'll continue to be more divided. I was thinking about this today on the train down here from Uppsala. In a way, the Republican strategy here is pretty easy to explain, because I'm of the view that it predates Trump. That at least since the mid-1990s, Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, they've been pulling on the threads of democracy for a very simple reason, which is this. Since 1988, the Republican Party has won the national popular vote once. In all the presidential elections since 1988, they've won once. And that's 2004, George W. Bush's re-election. He got the majority by a very slim margin. And so I think a cynical strategy by Republicans, going back at least to the 90s, could go back even further. Probably could go back to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968 if we want to discuss that. But this has been a naked attempt to play on white grievance, white fear. It's been remarkably effective. Trump in that sense didn't, I think, originate this, but he is an accelerator. And the accelerator part is really important. I don't want to minimize his role in this. We can talk about that further. The point is, I think Americans have lost a sense of community. Because a nation is more than an economy. There's community. And I think our civil bonds in America have frayed. I think Trump, the genius of Trump is that he understood that he could exploit this. That structural and economic changes in American society over the past, say, half century have allowed this to happen. People have become more segregated, especially on the basis of education. Trump could see that he had a way in for that. The result, I think, is that we've had a kind of sorting mechanism. And people now live very separate lives. The blue states are becoming bluer. The red states are becoming redder. In my little piece in the magazine that PJ mentioned, I talk about the importance of civic organizations in American history. This is something that goes back all the way to Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s. The Frenchman marveled that these Americans come together in these associations. That's what's in a sense stopped happening, and that's a concern. So why am I nevertheless optimistic? I have more here that I could talk about. And I was going to talk a little bit about the importance of empathy, which is a concept that I've been studying myself, including at SKAS in Uppsala, especially with respect to recent American political history. But let me say just a few words about why I'm optimistic, and then maybe we can open it up for some discussion. I think one reason I'm optimistic is because I'm an immigrant. In other words, I've come to the United States. I wasn't born there, Swedish. And I do think sometimes, at least, immigrants tend to, maybe this is true also in Sweden, we tend to see the glass as half full, maybe, or at least I am. We've seen, this is worth noting, we've seen various institutions, as you all know, fighting back against Trump. The judiciary, major elements in the press, the professional bureaucracies in Washington have worked very hard, and I think broadly speaking, successfully to show resilience, to stand up against Trump. And these organizations are refusing to be bullied by Donald Trump and his associates. There is still, you can tell me whether you agree or disagree with the following. I think there is a dynamism and a vitality in America. I picked up on it when I first moved to the US, which was in the 1980s. I had emigrated with my family to Canada. So I went to high school in Vancouver. My undergraduate degree is from Canada, but then I came to the United States for graduate school. I picked up on this dynamism, this vitality, that day when I became a citizen in 2008 that I mentioned. I sensed it in the room. There's something about this place, and I think it's still there. There is this spirit of empathy. I want to believe that's there. It's a kind of patriotism, one that I think transcends partisanship. And by the way, partisanship is not necessarily a bad thing. We can talk about that. In fact, partisanship is necessary, and by the same token, bipartisanship is not necessarily a good thing in all instances. That's something we can come back to. I'm working, as PJ mentioned, on a biography. Here's volume 1. This fellow you all recognize. This came out 2 years ago. This is the American paperback edition. I'm working now in Uppsala, supposedly. We're having too much fun in Sweden. Because I have so many cousins and friends that we need to see, but I'm supposedly working in Uppsala on volume 2. So this one takes the story to the end of 1956. Volume 2 will take us the rest of the way. So it's the run for the presidency. It's his 1,000 days in the White House. It's civil rights, Cuba, the missile crisis, the space race, Vietnam, all the rest of it, and then of course the assassination in Dallas. But I wanted to mention Kennedy here briefly is because I think he personified much of what I'm talking about. He was far from perfect. He made mistakes in policy, certainly made mistakes in his personal life, as I think you all know. And I'm not going to argue this afternoon that he was a great president. I don't think he lived long enough, didn't experience the kind of crises that is necessary to be elevated to that top pantheon. Typically, we say we have 3 presidents in that group. Washington, the first, Lincoln, and FDR. John F. Kennedy's not in that group. But he might be in the second echelon, because I think he had greatness within. Through his visionary leadership and his inspired rhetoric, he summoned the narrative of American hope. He challenged people to believe in a better society at home while embracing America's leadership position abroad. And of course, as I think you all know, he challenged Americans, and this is something he got from his parents. I write about it in here. Challenged Americans to believe in something greater than themselves. Ask not, from his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Maybe even in Sweden, that has a certain resonance. Fråga inte vad ditt land kan göra för dig. So Kennedy, I think about him a lot, not only because I'm writing about him, but because I wonder how he would respond to this moment. He understood, I think, that in a democracy, good faith bargaining between the parties is imperative. This idea that there will be mutual concessions. I'm not going to get everything that I want, nor will you, but we're going to bargain about this. Kennedy understood that. He understood something important, which is dignity. That acting in a dignified manner, treating others with respect appropriate to their dignity, is crucial. Something that Donald Trump utterly does not understand. I have a simple test for political leadership that I sometimes use, including with my students. The simple test is this: is the person serious? Is the person serious? Serious about their job, serious about the responsibilities they have as a leader? Donald Trump is not serious. Boris Johnson is not serious. But there are lots of examples in American history and in other countries where I think that measure is met. The person is serious. JFK, I think, was one of those people. There have been other leaders, including Republicans, who I think are serious. Mitt Romney, who was the candidate in 2012, and who's now, of course, a senator from Utah, he's serious. One final point that I want to make, and then we can go to some discussion. My colleague at Harvard, Jim Kloppenberg, who is a historian, a wonderful person, who, by the way, with another friend of mine who is a journalist in Washington, E.J. Dionne, columnist for the Washington Post, among others. E.J. and Jim are writing a book together right now about social democracy in a kind of international context. And so they're going to have Sweden. They told me that Sweden's going to be an important part of the book. In fact, they asked me, who can be a Swedish research assistant for us on this book? But Jim, in a previous book called Toward Democracy, has an expression that I want to mention to you because I love it so much. He referred to the ethic of reciprocity. Ethic of reciprocity. Att man är, it's like mutuality. Ömsidighet, kanske. Ömsesidighet, yeah. So, ethic of reciprocity, what does it mean? What it means is a mutual respect, a recognition and a tolerance for one another. Even if we don't all share the same basic sort of moral positions. Politically, and this is key, especially in our current moment, it means allowing your worst enemies to govern if they win the election. Ethic of reciprocity. I think about that a lot. I also think about James Madison, who was the 4th president of the United States, one of the so-called founding fathers. Madison is interesting because he was both an optimist and a pessimist at the same time. He understood that people have selfish motives. People have selfish motives, selfish interests. But he still believed in democracy and in open conversation, Madison did, because he had confidence in the capacities of people to define their own lives, to care for people unlike themselves, to keep society progressing. So I think about Madison, going all the way back. Okay, I think that's enough from me. What we didn't get to, I'll just list a couple things we could talk about. Ways to maybe improve the democracy. Is a third party the answer? That's being floated about. We can talk about third parties. Ranked choice voting, which I'm quite excited about, is another thing that the United States could think about. Of course, outlawing gerrymandering. We could talk about reducing the role of money in politics. And the importance, I think, of centrism. This is another thing I thought about on the train down. I don't know if I'm right about this. I have to think about it further. But it seems to me that the presidents in the United States who have been the most effective have been in the center of their party. I think we would say that about Washington. They weren't really parties as such then, but he was a centrist fundamentally. Certainly true of Lincoln. It's certainly true of both the Roosevelts. Teddy Roosevelt, it's true of Franklin Roosevelt. It's true of Jack Kennedy. And various others. There's a certain epistemological modesty that I think comes with being in the center. It's about, in a sense, a kind of Burkean conservatism, meaning that change is important, but it should be incremental change. Maybe that's what we need. I'm not sure Joe Biden represents that. Maybe he does. But that's something else we can discuss. Let's turn to discussion. Thank you.
Ja, stort tack för detta Fredrik. Jättebra, jätteintressant inledning. Lunchseminarierna har en stor för- och en som också är en nackdel, nämligen att de är koncentrerade i tid. Vi har inte så mycket tid på oss, så ta nu tillfället i akt och gör inlägg och ställ frågor. Vem är först ut? Rickard, du får en mikrofon här. Micken höjer inte ljudet i lokalen, men det är för inspelningens skull. Stå gärna upp när du ställer frågan.
Ja, hejsan, Rickard Westerberg heter jag från Handelshögskolan. Tack Fredrik, spännande inledning här. Min fråga är, om du som historiker skulle peka ut, för det är en jättestor fråga, men 3 saker som har lett till den här polariseringen i USA. Vad är de 3 sakerna? Tack.
I would say first, since Rickard is asking me off the top of my head here, I would say first, stalling for time as I answer, that social media, I think, has played an important role in all of this, and maybe connected with that. If I can use them together as number one, not necessarily first in terms of importance, by the way, but the first one I'm listing, Fox News, maybe even talk radio. That the polarization has happened in part because, and I do hold Republicans more responsible for this. They have been able to drive a singular message that instills, it seems to me, both fear and anger in their supporters. They have allowed their supporters to live in a kind of echo chamber that I think has furthered this polarization. Second, I suppose I would maybe put in there, Rickard, the two-party system. The two-party system has worked in many ways. In fact, a decade ago, I would probably have said in this room that the two-party system actually functions very well in the United States. But I'm concerned, maybe combined with the first one, with the ability that we now have, not only Republicans but Democrats, liberals, conservatives, we can pay attention only to those voices with which we agree. Combine that with the fact that there are these two parties, I think it's a problem. And a third party, though I think there are structural reasons to believe that a third party probably could not actually flourish. We can come back to that. I think that's a second thing I would point to is the problems in the two-party system. And third, and I'm thinking of 5 or 6 here off the top of my head immediately, but the third one I'll mention so we can move on is Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court decision in 2010, which basically allowed wealthy individuals, certainly wealthy corporations, wealthy Americans, let's say, to influence politics in a way that I think is very pernicious, very problematic. I think it's a hugely important Supreme Court decision with unforeseen consequences, although I think there were people at the time who said this is terrible, but I don't think anybody quite understood just how terrible it is. That has allowed, it seems to me, that this balkanization to be furthered. And if I could just add a fourth, I would come back, Rika, to what I said before. That a very effective Republican strategy that in the short term I date to Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, which was basically to say, we're not going to cooperate anymore. We're going to practice a kind of scorched earth politics, and it's about denying legitimacy to the other side, has been incredibly effective.
Okej. Mick till Thomas Gyr, sedan Fredrik Sixtensson här framme.
Tack för väldigt intressant genomgång. Jag tänkte ställa en dels polemisk fråga och dels en ledande. Den polemiska frågan är ju då att är det relevant som man gör ofta om att en presidentkandidat eller en vald president inte har fått majoriteten av rösterna när, för det första, valsystemet medvetet inte handlar om att det är befolkningen som röstar. Det är ju faktiskt ett system som bygger på elektorat och som var grundlagsfädernas avsikt. För det andra, om valsystemet hade varit på det sättet så hade kanske voter turnout sett helt annorlunda ut. För det tredje, valkampanjerna hade ju sett helt annorlunda ut om man skulle appellera till hela befolkningen och inte till nyckelstater. Så är det ens relevant att säga att de fick inte majoritetsrösten när hela systemet avsiktligen inte är det? Alltså, det frågar jag som forskare. Använder du inte lite av demagogiska trick då när du säger att ingen har vunnit på det sättet? Det här var den polemiska frågan. Den ledande frågan är ju, jag håller helt med om det här med Trump och att inte bara att han är oseriös utan också att jag anser nog inte att tölpaktiga personer ens ska komma till poster oavsett om de har åsikter som är liknande mina eller inte. Emellertid tror jag det var väl 63 miljoner amerikaner som röstade på honom i det här valet, apropå voter turnout. 72 till och med. Vad är det de inte kan se som du och jag kan se hos dem, enligt din uppfattning?
Mycket bra frågor. Mycket bra frågor. The polemical question is a fair question. And maybe I'm guilty of a certain sleight of hand in emphasizing the fact that the Republicans only once since '88 have won the popular vote. Because you're right, it's not ultimately what decides the election. I still want to believe that it has meaning for us, that it matters. That not only is it a majority that's voting against the president who is going to take power, but the majority is actually going to be, I think, growing larger, and Republicans are aware of this. it's only a half answer to your question, because I think I don't have a better answer, and because you're absolutely right. It's the system we have. We have to work within the system we have. And it's based on the Electoral College, and as you say, it's based on key states. It's a certain number of battleground states that are going to decide, at least for the foreseeable future, every presidential election. And unless you have, and until you have a constitutional convention, which the smaller states are never going to allow, it just isn't going to happen. Until you have that kind of a convention, this system is going to persist. And I think Republicans nevertheless understand, the smarter ones among them, that at some point, if the margin in the popular vote gets sufficiently lopsided against them, then it's even going to affect these battleground states, and then they're going to lose presidential election after presidential election. The country's becoming much more diverse. Demographers of a certain kind will say Republicanism is on its last gasp because of the demographic changes. I'm not so sure. Latino voters, for example, Latino voters are turning to Republicans to a marked degree, in part because of misjudgments by Democrats. That's a separate topic. On your second question, it's a huge question. Maybe a leading question, but it's such an important question. 72 million Americans voted for the re-election of this person. It's to me stunning. And by the way, I'm not, as maybe is clear from my conversation, I'm not any kind of radical left person. I am what I like to call a knee-jerk centrist. And I would be in this country too. I think it's a sense on the part of many of them that we're losing a way of life. We're losing a dominant position within our society. I don't like this. I'm going to support the guy who speaks to this. And that's Donald Trump, and that's been the Republican Party. It's a pretty poor answer. I think there's more to it than that. There is a sense, it's become almost like a sporting thing where, it's my team. I'm going to support my team regardless. Maybe they're terrible, maybe they're good, but I'm going to support that team. And these are Republican voters who say, I don't really like everything that Trump is doing. I actually probably think he did lose the election. I don't buy this argument that he was denied the victory. I think most Republicans actually would tell you here or anywhere that in fact, yeah, Biden won. But we're going to stick with him because he's our guy.
Tack. Fredrik.
Ja. Tack så jättemycket för den intressanta genomgången. Jag har en fråga apropå den amerikanska mycket starka maktdelningen i förhållande till det. Och jag undrar om det är när det är så här polariserat som det är i USA, är det bra att man har så stark maktdelning eller är det något dåligt? Och jag frågar det här eftersom jag vill minnas att Francis Fukuyama skriver i sin Political Order and Political Decay att maktdelningen så som den är framtagen i USA funkar när samhället är ganska homogent och inte så splittrat. För att annars så leder det till de här blockeringarna så att politiken inte kan prestera. Vilket leder till mer förtrytelse. Det är i alla fall vad han säger. Jag tyckte det var ett kontraintuitivt men intressant argument. Jag undrar om du har några tankar om det?
Yeah, I think it is counterintuitive, and Fukuyama is he's really interesting to talk with, and very thoughtful person. Look, I would have said again when I became a citizen. Let's use that as the measure. I would have said in 2014, as a historian of the United States, as somebody who studies this stuff for a living, that the division of power in the United States has functioned remarkably well. Whatever mistakes have been made in foreign policy, many. Whatever shortcomings we have in American society, many. it works. I think today in 2022, I would pause, I would make that same, I probably would give the same answer, but I would give it more reluctantly. It's become so evident, Fredrik, that that the Senate in particular is wildly unrepresentative because of, for constitutional reasons, in terms of the makeup of the Senate, who gets elected to the Senate. And the Senate has such an outsized role, even vis-a-vis the House, that you have to say that that historic division that the founders came to at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which worked really well, isn't functioning. Now, the optimist might say, yeah, but you know what? Give it time. We'll get through this. Trump is not going to be forever. And in fact, you will see that this system that got us through the Civil War, the Gilded Age, which, as I say in my article, or my response here, the Gilded Age was in some ways similar to where we are today. We got through the Gilded Age. Civil rights protests in the 60s, anti-Vietnam. We've had challenging experiences, have gotten through them. Maybe it can work again, but no. But the Fukuyama, the counterintuitive argument is a powerful one.
Tack, Katarina.
Ja, tack så mycket. Katarina Tratsch heter jag. Jag har 2 frågor, ska försöka fatta dem kort. Den första relaterar till den första frågan, nämligen huvudorsaker bakom polarisering. Då nämner du social media, även vissa mer demagogiska kanaler, Fox News. Jag undrar om du kan reflektera lite utifrån den respons eller orsak, beroende på vem man frågar, som vi ser på andra sidan, nämligen woke-kultur, identitetspolitik och så vidare, vilken roll det kan ha haft. Min andra fråga, jättesvår men jättekort, om vi ser till vägar tillbaka, enande i det här, kan du peka på någonting som du tror kan ena nationen, så att säga?
Yeah, it is the case that the country is divided. That by definition means that you've got 2 sides here, and to a degree at least there's shared responsibility. Again, in my piece in here, I reject, partly for reasons of being provocative, I reject the notion of polarization. I suggest that in fact it's not really polarization when it's one party that is denying the outcome of an election and moving, it seems to me, in a worrisomely authoritarian direction. Whereas I would say that the Democratic Party hasn't really moved at all. I would say, I don't know what you guys think of this, but I would say that Joe Biden is not further to the left than, I don't know, Walter Mondale in 1984. I don't think he's further left than Bill Clinton in 1992. I don't think he's further left than Obama. I don't think Nancy Pelosi is left. I don't think Chuck Schumer, the leader in the Senate, is left. The Democratic Party, it seems to me, has more or less stayed where it is. We could. Nevertheless, you make a point, which is that the woke, what's the word we would use? Tendencies, the woke kinds of policy positions that elements in the Democratic Party have taken have contributed to this. And I'm distraught at some of those developments, which we see, by the way, even at my university, to a degree. But the woke left is not overturning elections. The woke left is not fundamentally questioning the veracity of our political system. It's an annoyance. I don't think of it as a grave threat to the future of the republic. So that's how I would make that distinction. But there's no doubt that what some of my colleagues refer to as the Maoist left is creating problems in American society, and it's probably true in Sweden and other places too. Oh boy, the second question is a good one. What can we point to, or what can we look to? I think, the fever is going to break at some point. The fever is going to break. I don't know if it means, if it's when Trump is gone from the scene. I don't have the sense that Ron DeSantis or other potential leaders of the Republican Party are going to inspire anything like the kind of almost cult-like following that Trump, for whatever reason, has generated. So that's one thing maybe one can look to. I have the sense that underneath the loud extremes on both sides, right and left, most Americans are more sensible and have an attachment to this enterprise, to this experiment called the American experiment, that I think will come to the fore. I do think civic organizations, to go back to that for a moment, have the potential to once again bring Americans together, where you're spending time with people who disagree with you, at least to some degree, and you understand we're in this together. So I don't want to sound, I don't want to get hokey here, but I do think that there's a way to see past this. It's a really good question you ask, but the beginning of an answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Jag för en talarlista här, man får gärna sätta upp sig på den. Man löper dock risken att inte hinna få ställa sin fråga eftersom vi är noga med stopptider och sånt där. Men chansa gärna. Jenny?
Ja, jag får instämma. Jätteintressant. Jenny Sonesson heter jag. Och jag har en fråga just om det demokratiska partiets framtid. Vad om du ser i spåkulan. Och för mig som inte är någon USA-expert utan ser mer på en amatörnivå, så känns det som att Demokraterna har svårt att rekrytera nya politiska talanger. Och man förstår inte, så ett stort land, och det är de här, man till och med pratar om att Hillary Clinton kanske ska göra en politisk comeback, har jag läst om. Och Kamala Harris verkar ju vara en stor besvikelse som vicepresident. Jag uppfattar det så. Vad beror det här på att man har svårt i det demokratiska partiet, eller stämmer det, att hitta nya politiska talanger? Och vad tror du om partiets framtid?
Nej, jag tror att det stämmer. Och det är konstigt. 340 miljoner människor. Och att det är svårt alltså. Att Joe Biden, som jag tycker har varit okej på många vis, men vad är han? 79, 80? Tänk dig en svensk statsminister som var 79, 80. Helt omöjligt. Sen är det konstigt, måste jag säga, att en svensk partiledare kan vara 36. Det förstår jag inte heller. Jättekonstigt tycker jag.
Då har de suttit länge, Fredrik. Ja.
Still wet behind the ears, som vi säger på engelska, när man är 36. Nej, men det är svårt. There are a few people in the party that I think have future potential. I think that the governor of California is really quite interesting to me. Now, can he navigate? The problem with the Democratic Party is that it's based on, it's very much a coalition. This is a problem for the party, and it's also a strength that you have so many groups within the Democratic coalition that you have to satisfy in order to have any chance to be the nominee. Navigating that, doing so in a way that doesn't piss off, or pardon my expression, doesn't annoy other parts of the coalition makes it really difficult. So part of the answer to your question is that it requires a certain number of attributes that few people have. Of course, it's also about finances. It's also about establishing yourself maybe as a governor or potentially as a senator, and then biding your time, and it's a process that generally takes decades, more so than for Republicans, which we can discuss. Which is a long-winded way of saying that I don't really have a good answer to your question. I do think that the Democratic Party has on its bench some in the House and in the Senate, including a few people who have been part of the January 6th committee, extraordinary people, who again are like me, a sort of they're pragmatic centrists, which personally is what I'm looking for, and I think they have leadership potential, but it's a long process.
Då ska vi se Louise och sen ger du micken till Jakob precis framför dig. Ja.
Hej, Louise Belfrage. Jag jobbar här på stiftelsen. Thank you. Tack för dina intressanta tankar. Jag skulle egentligen vilja att du pratade någonting om behovet av patriotism kanske. För i mina öron så låter det som att patriotismen har liksom åkt in i Trumpism. Man tror att man är patriot för att man är trumpist. Och så har man liksom misguided patriotism, och att man måste rätta till det där på något sätt. Men nu ångrar jag mig. Jag vill mycket hellre veta vad du tror om January 6th Committee.
Nej, men vi tar båda två. Jag fattar mig kort. Jag fattar mig kort. Nej, för det är så intressant. I think the Democrats have this is again where they get fearful. Unduly fearful, the Democrats. I wish that I could speak to Chuck Schumer about this and to Joe Biden about this. They should claim with great confidence patriotism in the way that I would define patriotism, which is in a sort of defensive, in a certain way, it's a defensive posture. It's a love of country, but it's not aggressive. It doesn't shy away from patriotism, but it's a kind of patriotism that invites others to come in. It's not like nationalism, which is much more aggressive. It's much more about power. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's a shame. It's an absolute scandal that Republicans have been allowed to claim the patriotism mantle. Why? I would make the argument that in fact what Trump represents is the opposite of patriotism. So that's really good. I think the January 6th Commission has been a surprise to me and to others. I think it has been an extraordinary effort that has vastly expanded our knowledge of what occurred, that has shown the degree to which Trump entered the election, prepared in advance to call this a victory, regardless of what happened. In other words, that he had decided beforehand that he was going to claim victory. I think they've shown us dramatic, for me at least, evidence that he had a sense that violence was going to happen on January 6th. What they have not been able to do, and I only saw the headlines about yesterday's session. I don't think they've been able to show a direct link that would stand up in court between what he was advocating and what occurred on January 6th. So that's one conclusion. Second, I'm not sure that, to use the American expression, I'm not sure it's moved the needle. You probably don't say that in Swedish, but you all know what I mean. I don't know that it's moved the needle again because of this balkanization. Maybe it's moved the needle with some independence, and that could make a difference in the election, which is to come in 3 weeks. But I would still say that this has been, in my judgment, an extraordinarily successful commission. It's no secret that they used a Hollywood producer to kind of set this thing up because it's beautifully done, but it's also, it seems to me, really effective.
Thanks. Jakob.
Tack så jättemycket för ett jätteintressant seminarium och väldigt givande att lyssna till dig. Jag håller ju helt med om att alltså det som Trump var under presidenttiden och det han företrädde var ju tulpaktighet. Samtidigt så ligger det någonting i det som har hörts här tidigare om att den andra sidan kan ju också ha haft en orsak till att så många röstade på honom. Jag tänker till exempel på just valet 2016 där Hillary Clinton talar om motståndarsidan som basket full of deplorables, och det är inte riktigt bra sätt om man vill värva röster från det landet och vara hela landets president. Sen tänker jag också kanske en lite mer större historisk sociologisk fråga. Du är väldigt mycket inne på de civic organizations och civilsamhälle, och där spelar ju kyrkorna en väldigt stor roll, och inte minst så har ju Tocqueville i sin bok Demokratin i Amerika lyfter han ju upp den betydelse om religionsfrihet och allt vad det innebär. Samtidigt så har vi också den här mixen mellan, eller sammanblandningen mellan patriotism och kristen nationalism som diskuteras väldigt mycket. Så det skulle vara intressant att höra dig prata lite grann om det. Om du bara kort kan beröra det. Tack så mycket.
Nej, men det som du säger först, det är ju helt sant att the Democrats, not just Hillary Clinton, but the Democrats have played into this with both tactical and strategic mistakes. And as you point out perfectly correctly, if you're trying to win votes in the middle of the electorate, it's not your partisans that matter. You have to win elections in the middle. It's probably not a good idea to refer to deplorables and to refer to Trump's supporters as deplorables. You could argue that she was actually kind of correct, but it's just unwise. And I think that this is, again, where the Democratic Party has made missteps. You could argue as a Democrat that Americans show this extraordinary proclivity to vote against their economic self-interest, and that this is frustrating. And how is it that these people are voting Republican when we're the ones who are supportive of an increase in Social Security, we're the ones supportive of an increase in unemployment insurance, we're the ones who want universal health care. But the point is, you can't, and those may be legitimate questions, but you can't make inroads on that basis. And the Democrats, for generations, certainly for decades, it seems to me, have been guilty of misplaying their hand, of not speaking to ordinary workers, blue-collar workers and others, in ways that resonate with them, that speak to their concerns, that responds to their diminished place in some respects in society. And that's going to be, some historian is going to come along to explain, I don't think it's happened yet, some historian is going to have to explain how did that happen over a period of decades, because Hillary Clinton is far from alone. On your second point about, I don't have too much to say there, except that the civic organizations, as I pointed out, I think are important. We've seen a dramatic reduction in those. My colleague Bob Putnam has a book called Bowling Alone, which you probably are familiar with. Maybe it even came out in Swedish, I don't know. But Bob's book about bowling alone, the title gives it away, speaks to the diminution in Americans' attachment to these organizations. And you're right, it has a religious dimension. Churches have performed that role. They still perform that role, much more now so for people who identify as conservatives or radicals, if depending on your perspective. Let's say far right. Then in the center, that used to not be the case. In Tocqueville's day, you couldn't put it really in political terms, and now you can. And I think it's a problem, again, for the Democratic Party that they don't have that core, absolutely, devoted constituency. I can say one other thing. As somebody who grew up both in Sweden and then in Canada i Pingstkyrkan, yes, Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, the identification of evangelical Christians with right-wing politics is something I do not understand. We can talk about this for hours, and I would be interested to hear somebody enlighten me on this, but I do not understand, as somebody who was in that tradition, grew up in it, why there should be that identification. Some part of me understands why, that it's partly about abortion, and some of these people are single-issue voters, but that's an insufficient answer. I think I went a little bit off the track.
Thanks. Nu går sista ordet från auditoriet till Lena Andersson.
Tack. Jag blir lite förvånad faktiskt över att du underbetonar woke-frågan och identitetspolitiken. Men jag har inte samma inblick i USA som du. Men jag uppfattar ju vänstern som oerhört aggressiv och auktoritär också i den frågan. Och också att de uppfattar hela projektet Amerika som orsaken till allt som woke vill ställa till rätta. Alltså, att de helt enkelt inte tror på det här projektet med det som founding fathers och så. Men i samband med det ska jag vilja fråga, har jag uppfattat det korrekt att det har skett en glidning i begreppet white supremacy? Jag har fattat det nu som att det inte längre betyder att man är vit maktrasist, utan den ordning som följer av det här samhället, det liberala samhället där vi har frihet, som får ett visst utfall. Om vita så att säga har den position de har nu i det här systemet med de rättigheterna och friheterna, så då stödjer man white supremacy. Jag har uppfattat att det har skett en glidning där. Det betyder inte längre vit maktgalning, utan att man egentligen inte vill totalt reformera det amerikanska och västerländska systemet. Jag kanske har fel, men så har jag hört den här lilla glidningen i alla fall.
Nej, jag tycker att det är en glidning. Jag måste tänka på det där lite grann. Ja, jag tar första frågan först. No, I think you're right that there are elements on the left who hold to exactly the position that you've just described very well. No question. And certainly in the academic world, of which I'm a part, you maybe see more of that. So I experience it to a greater degree than maybe somebody who is not in academia might experience it. Although I would say that even in academia, it's less prevalent than people on the right would have you believe. You have the sense that, you know, if you listen to Fox News or other things, that American universities are just rife with people who deny debate, who are sort of totally intolerant. It's the intolerance of tolerance, they would say. And that's not been my experience. In my own classroom, we have people on the right, we have people on the left. I like to think we have a healthy debate. People listen to one another. But still, you're quite right to articulate this. I still think, however, it's less of a problem than maybe you're suggesting, at least in political terms. You have some members of Congress who identify as socialists, democratic left, who would subscribe to at least some of what you're talking about. But they are in safely blue districts. They are a very small number, maybe 6 or 8 in the House, nobody in the Senate. So in political terms, and even in the states, I would say it's a minority position. That the weight of the Democratic Party, which is the party in the United States that is more on the left, it's really a centrist party, as I've been suggesting, is not in any way beholden to the woke left. So I guess what I'm suggesting is, for me, it's a nuisance. It's annoying. I think it's hurting the Democratic Party, because I think Fox News every single day can play this, and it works for them in political terms. So it's a problem politically. I'm not as concerned about it in terms of what it represents for American democracy and for the future of the nation. And then I think we're out of time, but on the second one, I'll just say I think you're very perceptive. And I like this glidning, that something has shifted in terms of how white supremacy is defined. I don't know. Yeah.
All right.